You guys obviously have a great article out in the New Catalyst called Occupy in Retrospect. We're obviously going to link that down below. So last year was the 10th anniversary of Occupy Wall Street, and I want to make clear your article isn't really about Occupy, right? It's more of a response to all of these sort of glowing retrospectives that came out last year. And you guys are arguing that these retrospectives, for the most part, advance an incorrect origin story, particularly around the relationship between Occupy and the two Bernie Sanders campaigns that came after it. So just to kind of dive in, Ben, maybe if you want to start with, like, what is the commonly understood Occupy origin story that you guys are sort of arguing against? And then maybe, Christie, if you can pick up where it goes wrong and how this origin myth took root.
Sure. I think anyone who reads left publications saw the sort of flurry of Occupy retrospectives around like October 2021, which was the 10-year anniversary. And most of those articles recognize certain shortcomings in the movement, and they sort of reject what they see now as an immature, demandless horizontalism that was a real hindrance to the sort of growth and success of Occupy. But they nonetheless see it as the origin, a really important political origin for a lot of things that came after. Black Lives Matter, the Bernie Sanders campaigns, and the rejuvenation of the Democratic Socialists of America. And in all those ways, it sort of sees Occupy as a kind of rebirth of left politics and the origin of all of these things that came afterwards. So that's the myth, and I think it's fairly common, again, in sort of most left publications. And I'll let Christie explain why we think it's a myth.
Right. So I think the point for us is that while Occupy preceded these other developments like BLM, Bernie, or DSA, it didn't cause them. The cause is, I think, much more a combination of ongoing political conditions, particularly the financial crash of 2008, but also like 30 years of unrelenting neoliberalism before then. And Occupy was, as we say in the article, the last instance of kind of the same old response of the left to these 30 years of neoliberal rule, which were mostly ineffectual and involved no programmatic response that's being pursued in an organized, strategic way. So I think we see it as important to see that Occupy was not the beginning, but really the end for a few reasons, which is kind of part of, I think, Jen's question as to why the myth. Our answer, I think, is first that there were real tensions that persist. There are real tensions that persist in the left today that can be traced back to how people came to be involved in left politics. And the myth sort of functions to authorize people who came from that Occupy background. It authorizes them to assume positions of authority within left spaces today that they haven't maybe, in fact, earned because they haven't been doing, the type of strategic, more strategic, universalist, demand-based politics that have cropped up since the Bernie Sanders campaign any longer than anyone else that's new to the left in this period has. We're all sort of figuring this out together, and yet you have these voices speaking with authority because they were there from the beginning, from Occupy. And I think we also want to point out that there are material incentives that exist for those who came out of Occupy to perpetuate this sort of Occupy origin story myth, that many of them made careers in left media out of this experience. So it's sort of a legitimation narrative that continues to allow certain people to take up disproportionate amount of space in and among left discussions today.
So it seems like one sort of central point of that tension is specifically the myth that Occupy led to Bernie Sanders, that you can draw a direct line from the people who were at Occupy, the movement itself, to the two Bernie Sanders campaigns. You guys actually argue that the relationship kind of goes the other way. Ben, can you explain how that works? Because I think that if you were to just kind of take a cursory look at like the language of Occupy Wall Street, the 1% versus the 99%, and also a lot of prominent Occupy Wall Street people actually went on to literally become part of the Bernie Sanders campaign. But why did Occupy not actually generate the two Bernie Sanders campaigns?
Great. So in the article, we sort of distinguish between sort of these two things. On the one hand, the rhetoric and the ideology behind the two, and on the other hand, the people. And as you say, there's a lot of like commonality there. But just starting with the rhetoric, it's true that Bernie Sanders, I mean, there are those, well-known YouTube videos online of Bernie going back 30 years, and he sort of says the same things over and over. But he does, and his campaigns did adopt the sort of 1% versus the 99% language, which did come out of Occupy. And in both camps, there's this, there's a kind of anti-capitalism. But I think that as far as the sort of rhetoric goes, that's sort of where the commonalities end, just on the face of it, right? If you look at like what Occupy was about, and we quote an article from John Hammond where he identifies 5 sort of key traits of Occupy activism. And he says that there are 5 things that characterize Occupy. It's horizontalism, so no formal leadership, prefiguration, like attempting to model the future desired society, autonomy from the state, mutual aid, and defiance of government authority. And all 5 of those things, if you think about like what the Bernie Sanders campaigns were about, it's just, there's a clear disconnect there, right? I mean, there was vying for state power. It was organized around a clear leader. There were concrete demands, Medicare for all, a Green New Deal, et cetera. And in all those ways, they're just clearly different, right? And I think this is maybe where the limits of the word anti-capitalism come in, and why we ought to defend democratic socialism as something concrete and different from just anti-capitalism in a very vague sense. And if you just say anti-capitalist, sure, like Occupy and Bernie both fit within that phrase. But there's a clear difference between Occupy anarchism and democratic socialism. So that's like, just on the face of it, I think that the Occupy origin story has to make sense of that break. And we want to argue that there's a clear difference there. And then the second aspect, the people. So there were a lot of people who were involved with Occupy who eventually became involved with the Bernie Sanders campaigns. But in the article, we look back at sort of around 2014, 2015 to see what was going on around then. And I think in the Occupy origin story, there's this idea that the insufficiency of Occupy itself led people on their own accord to mature in their political orientation. And that's what led them to the Bernie Sanders campaigns. And what we argue is that if you look at the time, like before Bernie's first primary run, there wasn't really much progression in the so-called movement, right? There was a lot of stagnation. They kept going back to Zuccotti. A lot of the news stories focused on high-profile arrests. Micah White, who's now sort of called out as a kind of Occupy grifter, was one of the most prominent faces of the movement, right? And then Bernie comes along and all that changes. And our basic argument is just that, the Bernie primaries were the best things happening in the activist world. So of course, a lot of people were absorbed into those campaigns, but they were absorbed by the new emphasis, by the majoritarian orientation. And they shifted in their political orientation from kind of liberal anarchists into liberal socialists. And that was great. I think that all of us matured in our political orientation through the Bernie campaigns. But to say that they shifted beforehand and led the charge, I think is just an inaccurate rendering of the story.
And another piece of that is that you guys argue that the Bernie campaigns, because they were so successful, kind of had the effect of sort of retrospectively legitimizing what had happened at Occupy. Christie, can you speak a little bit about that?
Sure. I think this was one of the things that was so striking about some of the articles that came out this year. Mm-hmm. For those of us that were there and remember Occupy, we remember, I think, what a mess this was compared to what we did during the Bernie years.
Right.
And yet somehow this was supposed to have been the beginning. And in the article, I think we look at the relative popularity of Occupy versus Sanders-style economic reforms to sort of make this distinction. Occupy didn't make, I think, anti-capitalism popular. It didn't pave the path toward these being these like more economic reform, universalist bread and butter demands being something that people wanted to rally behind, it did provide a surprising metric, I think, of how widespread discontent had gotten at that point. But the discontent really preceded it and was in ample evidence in polling beforehand. I think we quote Gitlin in saying that even before the Zuccotti Park occupation, polls consistently showed supermajority support, I think something like 60%, for progressive economic reforms like raising taxes on the rich. And in the article, we compared this to a poll that was conducted around the time that Zuccotti Park was being dismantled, in which support of Occupy tactics is polling around 20%. So if anything, really, Occupy tainted the message insofar as it associated economic populism with fringe political groups and activities.
So let me actually expand this into sort of a broader question, because you had alluded to in a little while ago was that, the point of kind of correcting this Occupy origin myth isn't just that, isn't just doing it for the sake of it, but that it has implications for organizing today. So let's talk about kind of professional activism, because I think right now, in the absence of a critical mass of, actual real institutions on the left is obviously largely volunteer based, right? So actually, I mean, you both are Medicare for All organizers, in addition to having day jobs and families. And it's obviously it's questionable how sustainable this can be long term. Now, obviously, the flip side is that, when you start to professionalize left organizing, that kind of also opens the door to what we might call activismists, like people who are activists just for the sake of it, and also careerists. It's kind of a difficult thing, and it depends a lot on, it's very ambiguous, I think, right? So this is a long-winded way of asking, can you guys talk a little bit about both the bad and the good of professional activism and how you think we can navigate this tension?
So this is, answering this is sort of providing an answer to your last question as well, about the sort of rejuvenation of Occupy as something that maybe matters more today than it did at the time. And I think, to your previous question, Bernie did give did lend some importance to Occupy, retroactively, right? Occupy became something more important because of the sort of rejuvenation of democratic socialism. I don't think it was necessarily the Bernie campaigns that were completely responsible for that, though. Mm-hmm. And this gets to your question, which is that the remarkable thing about Occupy Wall Street, and Christie referred to this earlier, is that so many of the prominent people involved in it professionalized their activism.
Right.
A lot of those people got jobs at left publications. They got jobs in the sort of left nonprofit world. They started their own nonprofits. They started their own organizations. And, if you just go down the list of sort of the prominent people, and Todd Gitlin has a book about Occupy. Michael Levitin recently published a book about Occupy. All the people mentioned in there are either, fairly prominent sort of left media figures, or are in lead positions at different nonprofits or political organizations. And it's a remarkable feat, really. I mean, it's a kind of accomplishment of occupiers to have professionalized their activism. The difficult thing, as we sort of point out in the article, is that professional orientation did grate against Bernie's universalism and social democratic demands at the time. And it's what's responsible for sort of keeping Occupy in memory, and for why there were so many glowing retrospectives in the 10th year anniversary. But again, it was sort of problematic, I think, at the time. Anyone who sort of lived through the two Bernie campaigns knows that there was a lot of contention on the left. And yes, that there were some social media squabbles and just sort of general political immaturity, but there were some clear ideological divides too. And I think that just sort of covering over that doesn't help make sense of what actually happened during that time. In terms of your other question about just professionals, I mean, I think that, as you alluded to, any movement, if it's going to sustain itself, needs to professionalize. It needs to at least have people who are doing things full time for money. right?
Right.
And there are better and worse ways of doing that. There are a lot of sort of like worker-centered kind of organizations that end up just sort of being glorified nonprofits in their advocacy for sort of the most vulnerable workers in our society. And then there are organizations that sort of look very similar, but actually do sort of form themselves into actual worker organizations. Like just because I'm doing some research about this right now, I mean, if you look at the difference between something like the National Domestic Workers Alliance, which is, it doesn't really have much of a dues paying membership that they're trying to work in that direction. And it's mainly just a sort of advocacy organization for domestic workers. Mm-hmm. You compare that to something like the New York Taxi Workers Alliance, that's, mainly funded by dues at this point. And it's led by some sort of professionalized leaders like Barabi Desai, but they keep the interests of workers in mind, and they try to act as much like a union as possible. So there's better and worse ways of sort of professionalizing one's activism, obviously.
So I don't want to pretend to have a strong answer to this question. It's genuinely difficult, I think, as Jen said. Mm-hmm. I think we don't have in recent memory real models for how you run an all volunteer dues-based operation. I mean, you have union organizers who have this experience to some extent, but that's really where we need to get, and what the Sanders campaign, I think, laid the foundation for. We need some operation that provides an opportunity for people to plug in for the maybe 2 hours a week that they have, right. Potentially to give after work and family and other obligations. And I just don't see that as something that professional organizers are necessarily incentivized to create, in part because the nonprofit model has carried on just fine for years, mobilizing just a small handful of sort of representative, marginalized population, whoever they're fighting for, they can get, the handful of faces that they need, and people for interviews or lobby days or what have you, and they can be just fine mobilizing that kind of small number. They don't rely on massive marches or coordinated actions or things of that sort to keep their organizations going.
I would be remiss to miss the opportunity to mention that this touches on everyone's favorite debate, which is about the professional managerial class. And I think that one thing that people often get wrong in that is, as much fun as it is to make fun of sort of PMC culture and whatnot, the point is not to dismiss the entire class, right? Mm-hmm. In any sort of solid left movement, there need to be people who have professionalized their activism in some way, right? But there are better and worse ways to do that. And the issue with the PMC is that there are structural tendencies baked into their class position that lead in bad directions. And that's the point, right? Not that they can't do good things, not that professionalized activists like staff organizers at unions, for instance, but not that they can't do good things, just that there are certain incentives baked into that particular position within society that oftentimes lead in the wrong direction.
Right. Now that we've covered kind of some of the lingering bad habits of Occupy, I really want to ask you, because you were also both heavily involved in the Bernie Sanders campaigns as canvassers and, phone bankers and volunteers. Do you think that the organizing around the Bernie campaigns had a positive effect or changed or reoriented the American left in any way?
Yes. It's hard to know where to sort of begin to speak, and I think I would say it's, first of all, ideologically, it introduced universalist sort of bread and butter demands like Medicare for all as being a thing that people can ask for and organize around. Yeah. And to some extent, it really created some infrastructure for that organizing, some of which has stuck around and some of which has sort of faded away. Mm-hmm. But I think the thing that I would focus on in thinking about what it did or have been thinking about is just the number of people who now have basic organizing experience and skills. Yeah. And that's just massive and sort of hard to calculate what impact it will have. on future fights down the road. I think probably something like 95% of the people who I know today who can host a phone bank or organize a canvas probably got those skills through one of the Bernie campaigns. And I think that prepares us, it situates us well for future fights, that we have just massive numbers of people who can do that now, who couldn't do that before the campaigns. This is just sort of the tip of the iceberg, I think, in terms of what the Bernie campaigns did for the American left. But I'm wondering what Ben has to say.
I mean, I think about the Bernie campaigns as offering us a very clear example of what can work when you prioritize working class demands. I think that there, in retrospect, were a lot of faults as well. I think that sometimes we can be in a little bit too defensive about the Bernie campaigns as well. Sure. I certainly find myself doing this all the time, arguing that I think it was the most important sort of political moment to happen in my lifetime. Really, it was an opening. It was a majoritarian opening. It's closed very quickly for a lot of different reasons. And I think that in retrospect, one thing that was weak about the campaigns that we should definitely learn from is that there wasn't really any sort of attempt to create independent organization out of it. There was an attempt in 2016 with Our Revolution to take the sort of Bernie list and turn that into its own organization. I think to some extent, DSA stole Our Revolution's thunder. But in 2020, there hasn't been any attempt to do that, right? There's all these lists and Bernie organizers and infrastructure that's just sort of sitting there, and it was abandoned. And maybe there was good reason for that. COVID certainly didn't help, right? I mean, politics where you can't be next to other people in person is just sort of not possible. So hopefully, as COVID restrictions die down and people start getting together again, we can begin to sort of resume something like that. But I think those were sort of concrete failures of the campaigns, not to have led to some kind of organization or infrastructure that took all of the Bernie work and translated it to something besides just Democratic Party stuff. Because we're really feeling the pain of not having made that transition.
Yeah, I think you guys are both already sort of hinting at this, but I suppose just to wrap everything up, let's talk about kind of the terrain of the American left now in the post-Bernie era. This is obviously the ongoing question. I have to shout out the recent Jacobin issue, which is called The Left in Purgatory. So clearly, lots of people are thinking about this right now. Based on everything that we've discussed so far, what are the main roadblocks that you guys think we're running into in kind of the post-Bernie era, which, as I said, you've already sort of begun to touch on? And then just to kind of end on maybe a forward-looking note, what kinds of political strategies do you see do you think might be the most successful way to get around those roadblocks?
One of the first things that comes to my mind when I think about roadblocks is just how in this period of sort of defeat or purgatory of the left, our old infighting has returned in a way that has been pretty disappointing to me, to see lines drawn in the sand within left ranks around things that I don't think actually divide us, or certainly shouldn't divide us when it comes to organizing around the big picture. And that's, I think, something that we have to work through. And I think the best way to do it is to be fighting for something in common. Campaigns tend to, I think when people are doing real work together, it tends to make those kind of smaller, pettier conflicts fade into the background. I also think, obviously it's just now compared to the Sanders era, it feels hard to know what there is to fight for today. A lot of the old fights have had the steam taken out of them. Medicare for All, for example, feels obviously much less viable today than it did when we had a real prospect of a Sanders presidency. But I think there are still things to fight for, and we need to be organizing campaigns around those things. It's just harder to do than it was 3 years ago. for example, I think down ballot elections are important and possible, and especially intermediate legislative fights. And I think we need to be thinking really intelligently about what kind of fights are paving a path for our bigger down the road demands. I think some of the criteria that I think about when I'm thinking about what are worthwhile like legislation to fight for, I'm thinking about things that are tied rhetorically and logistically to the big demands, things that cut away the concentration and power of capital in strategic industries, things that create model institutions or processes that we can or would continue to expand. And also, probably most importantly to me, is strengthening our ability to organize by creating and expanding constituencies by winning things. So I think there are things that we have to win and that we should be winning them insofar as we're able to, and in winning them, showing people that politics, that real change that could be felt at the daily level is possible, and that people can engage in left politics to make those things happen.
Yeah, I mean, as far as hindrances to the actually existing left, the fact that a lot of normal people have primarily negative thoughts when they hear the word socialist is obviously not a good sign. And I hate to say it, but I think it's true. Like, outside of the circle of friends that I have that are leftists or socialists, a lot of people associate it with a kind of shrill online culture, and getting away from that, I think, is important. And I think part of that is not just being class focused, but sort of class based as well. I don't know that I see that transition coming anytime soon. I think partly for reasons that we identify in the article, which is that a lot of the sort of Occupy kind of activists have really embedded themselves in the left media worlds and left nonprofit worlds. And, activistism, as it was sort of defined, in the Doug Henwood, Liza Featherstone, and Christian Parenti article from the 90s, I want to say. It was early 2000s. I think so, maybe.
Yeah, or early 2000s, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they sort of see it as just sort of like spinning your wheels, right? Like, not like no sort of strategic vision, just doing things to do things. And, I mean, part of that comes from frustration, but part of it comes from this sort of activist culture that's been professionalized, right? Like when it's their jobs to be doing things that have to do with politics. I mean, that's the reason why I get, 20 emails a day telling me I got to do something right now, or like the world's going to end. And so, it's really hard to break out of that when you've got, small groups of volunteers trying to do something different, and this sort of well-funded activist set that's been professionalized, on the other hand, just sort of stoking this constant sort of energy. It's a difficult thing to get out of. I talked to someone the other day who said that, like, everything that we're doing now is not that important, but what we're hoping for is that we're at least like clearing the path for a sort of upsurge in labor activism. So if this is the 2020s, like the 1920s, sort of trying to like clear the brush so that like something can happen in the 30s. That seems like an optimistic view to me. But I think that's the sort of like, one of the best things that we could hope for, albeit like not like, of course, the social conditions that led to that upsurge.
Well, I mean, I wanted to just kind of really ask the last question, and you sort of answered it a little bit, but do you guys see any bright spots? Because obviously you're both partisans of Medicare for all, as am I. What should those of us who want to sort of break out of this kind of stasis keep our eye on?
I think no one really anticipated 2015, 2016 Bernie. And if I'm going to be really optimistic, I'm going to say like something like that is going to come around again. And it's just a matter of, in the meantime, clearing the brush, as Ben's friend says. That's what we have to be doing to continue to develop organizers, to increase our ranks, and to build connective tissues between existing left institutions that are going to be useful the next time something like this comes around. I think we're doing that here in New York City, and I'm encouraged to think that, though I don't know about or see it myself necessarily, there are likely similar initiatives spread out across the country and happening that are doing exactly that, preparing the groundwork for the next time there's a major mass opportunity for us to organize. That's my optimistic take.
It's a difficult time. I mean, I think that right now we're at a kind of like nadir of interest and energy because most, like anyone on the sort of like liberal left who thought there was like an opening with Biden to like sort of like infiltrate like the halls of power and like do something regardless of the fact that he's Joe Biden, is now realizing that there's a block there, right? That there's only so much we can do. That being said, I don't doubt that once like, people start stoking, enthusiasm for 2024, right? And like, once again, trying to defeat fascism, that a lot of that energy is going to be devoted to that. Mm-hmm. And I think that sort of breaking out of that cycle is the key thing. How we do that precisely is a difficult question. I think that, as far as the bright spots go, the sort of like union reform campaigns, mm-hmm. I would say are the sort of like brightest. The fact that there's new leadership at the Teamsters is very promising, and that there are sort of like union reform fights happening around the country. If there can be some kind of pull outside of the Democratic Party, I mean, that seems like the brightest thing we have to hold on to at the moment.
All right. Well, again, Ben and Christie's article in the New Catalyst is Occupy in Retrospect. We are linking that down below. Definitely read that and check it out. Guys, thank you so much for your time. It was really good to see you.
Thanks for having us, Jen.
You too. Thanks, Jen.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.